talking about is an epic case of bad timing. An epic case of bad timing, which I believe goes a long way towards explaining why our governments, why our elites in places like Le Bourget and at 20 meetings before this 21st Conference of the Parties have failed so miserably to rise to the civilizational challenge that is climate change. And that they have failed is beyond debate. Since they have been talking for longer than the young people in this room have been alive, emissions have increased by more than 60% globally. The more they talk, the more emissions rise. And this conference is no different. We have seen some wonderful speeches. We have heard talk of bold pledges and high ambition. And yet the hard realities and the hard facts remain. And those facts are that no matter what the governments that call themselves ambitious claim, the actual promises, the actual targets that they have brought to this summit lead us to an extremely dangerous world. They don't lead us to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. They lead us to warming of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, which is beyond catastrophic. And beyond that, they have also told us that we can't even hold them to the pledges that they are bringing, that this agreement will not be legally binding. So what we're going to be talking about here tonight are agreements that are very much legally binding. And these are the trade agreements that these same governments negotiate in other spaces that very much have teeth, that very much have penalties, and that show that these same governments are capable of forging very complex agreements that are legally binding when those agreements serve multinational corporations. So the epic case of bad timing is that climate change had landed on our collective laps at precisely the moment when these free trade deals started to proliferate around the world. 1988 was the year that our governments first held an intergovernmental meeting about climate change. 1988 was the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed. 1988 was the year that the famous climate scientist who's here in Paris for this summit, James Hansen, formerly of NASA, testified before the US Congress that he now could say with a high degree of certainty that humans were causing the planet to warm. 1988 was the year that we lost all ability to claim that we didn't know, that we weren't sure, because that was the year that our governments decided we had to act. So what else was happening in 1988? Well, it was the year that Canada and the United States signed the first free trade agreement that was eventually expanded into NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which became the model for all these free trade agreements that have proliferated around the world. It was also the year before the Berlin Wall collapsed. It was the very moment when Francis Fukuyama famously declared that history was over. And now there was what you in France call the pensée unique, the one way of thinking that spread around the world, what in most parts of the world is called neoliberalism. And we know the tenets of neoliberalism: privatization, deregulation, cuts to taxes for the wealthy and the corporations, paid for with austerity for everybody else. All of it locked in with these corporate free trade deals that makes it so very hard to change, as you know so well here in Europe when you've tried to change. So that is the epic case of bad timing. And the epic case of bad timing also involves the fact that what was being enshrined in these trade deals was the highest emitting, most wasteful model of consumption imaginable, right? This form of consumption that imagined that distance didn't matter, that it didn't matter how far our goods traveled to get to us, and so we've seen a huge spike in emissions related to transportation and shipping because our goods travel so far, and yet the emissions from transportation and shipping are not even included in what is being discussed in these trade deals. And in fact, there were attempts to put it into the negotiating text, and they have been so far successfully fought off. So we have seen, alongside the globalization of this particular model of consumption, and I say this particular model because when the rules of trade were being written, we could have decided on different priorities. We could have decided on a development model that was low emission. We had that opportunity. But instead, our politicians did something pretty sneaky, which is they made sure that if it ever came down to it, that trade would always trump climate. And it was so clear that this fact is actually written into the UN Climate Treaty that is the basis for all of these negotiations that was signed in Rio in 1992. That agreement states that, quote, measures taken to combat climate change, including unilateral ones, should not constitute a disguised restriction on international trade. So it said that explicitly, and very similar language was put into the Kyoto Protocol. So what was being said is you can talk about whatever you want about the need to do something about climate change, but if it ever comes down to it, trade trumps climate. And one of the things, when I was writing this Changes Everything, what I looked at is what this has meant in practice. And it's meant something very explicit. It's meant that in case after case, where people have tried to take climate change seriously and put laws in place, invariably under huge pressure from below, from social movements demanding that governments act, in many cases, those policies have been challenged, and too often successfully challenged, using these trade deals as tools. So I'm just going to give you 3 examples to set the stage. One is very close to home for me. I live in Toronto, Ontario, and we're lucky in Ontario that our government introduced a pretty bold climate policy in the midst of the financial crisis in 2009. It's the kind of thing that should have happened in many European countries in the midst of the financial crisis. Basically what was going on is we had a jobs crisis, as you have in Europe, because factories were closing. And of course, we also have a climate crisis. So our government introduced a green energy plan, which was the boldest in North America. It pledged to get our province off of coal completely by 2014, but to do so in a way that would create huge numbers of manufacturing jobs. So they introduced a feed-in tariff and also a requirement that 40 to 60% of the technology used, of the green technology used, had to be made in Ontario, 40 to 60%. It created 31,000 jobs very, very quickly. And it was a success. Many workers who had lost their jobs in auto plants got jobs making solar panels. This is the essence of a just transition. This is what we mean by a just transition. More text, that has been another phrase that has been taken out of the text of the agreement and pushed into a non-binding preamble going well until we were challenged at the World Trade Organization by the European Union and Japan, who said that this was discrimination against their right to unfettered free trade and access to markets. And the WTO ruled against us. Trade trumps climate. So we were overturned. Quebec, under huge pressure from social movements, has probably the most powerful environmental movement, or one of the most powerful environmental movements in our country, won one of the very first bans on fracking. Do we have a few Quebecers in here? Yes, they were ahead of France. They were ahead of France. And then Quebec was challenged under NAFTA, under one of these investor rights clauses that allows multinational corporations to sue governments. They were sued by a company called Lone Pine for their lost profits. Their lost profits because this apparently infringed on their rights to frack for gas under the St. Lawrence River. And the trick was, the really clever part, was that this was actually a Canadian company that just incorporated itself in the US and pretended to not be Canadian so that it could sue its own government. So this is how these trade deals work against the types of victories that we know that we have been winning, against the Keystone XL pipeline, against Arctic drilling, against fracking here in France, against coal mining in Germany. This is where we have to move precisely because our governments won't lead. But we have to understand that corporations, as we win, are going to be using these trade deals as tools against us, and we can't let them do it. So we have to understand their tactics. Another case, Germany, and my friend Tajio Müller is going to be talking to you about Germany's energy transition, which, imperfect as it is a model for energy democracy, because in hundreds of towns and cities, people have taken back control over their energy grids from private companies that took them over, and they are keeping the profits from generating energy in their communities. And Germany is now getting 30% of their electricity from renewables, much of it decentralized. They've created 400,000 jobs, but Germany is facing two challenges using a similar investor state clause by the Swedish company Vattenfall that says that this energy transition, which is the kind of energy transition we need to see around the world, impinges on their right to generate power through coal and through nuclear power. So this is another example of how trade is trumping the climate, and we can't let them do it. So I just want to read a quote from you that I think really sums this up. It's from the Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. And he was talking about the fact that these agreements that were written decades ago are increasingly being used to stand in the way of good climate policy. And he was commenting on the fact that the United States was challenging China and India for their supports for renewable energy, which makes absolutely no sense. If you listen to our governments right now in the Bourget, they're all pointing fingers at each other about who is more ambitious, who's doing enough, who's not doing enough, and yet these same governments go to the World Trade Organization and try to knock down each other's windmills. And so what Joseph Stiglitz said was, should you let a group of foolish lawyers who put something together before they understood these issues interfere with saving the planet? Which seems like a very good question. But we do understand it now. You know, the lawyers understand it, but they are still making sure that there is no reference to climate change in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They are still making sure that in new deals, like the trade deal like TTIP between the European Union and the United States, like the similar deal between the European Union and Canada, they are protected from what they see as discrimination, so that governments can't favor renewable energy over fossil fuels or the kind of sensible trade that we would want our governments to do. But I think there's something even more insidious, because if you look at what is going on at Le Bourget, this climate deal, in a way, failed before it even began. Because before our governments even got to Paris, we heard from the United States, from the Obama administration, that this could not be a legally binding deal. They said that to begin with, and everybody had to accommodate that. Why? Because everybody understands that the United States cannot take a binding climate treaty to the US Congress. Why? Because it is controlled by politicians who are bought and paid for by the oil and gas industry. And the oil and gas industry and the ultimate irony is that these same oil and gas companies are inside those negotiations for trade agreements between Europe and the United States and between Europe and Canada, making sure that those deals are as binding as possible, and that they have, in Chevron's words, a, quote, world-class investment chapter, which means that Chevron and companies like it are able to sue our governments should we interfere with their future profits. Now, one of the most painful aspects of these negotiations is that in exchange for setting a target of warming that may allow the low-lying Pacific Islands to survive, and I say may, because they may not even, but just for allowing the numbers 1.5 to potentially be in this text, our governments are demanding that those countries explicitly give up their right to seek loss and damages for climate change. It says it in the text right now. There's an asterisk next to the phrase loss and damage, and it says, so long as this is not interpreted as the right, a legal right to sue. At the same time, the fossil fuel companies are ensuring that they have the right to sue us for their loss and damages. The same fossil fuel companies, like Exxon, who have been systematically funding climate change denial for decades and standing in the way of the policies that would save our planet. So the job of our movement is to flip this. It's to flip this. We need a system that allows the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable people to have the resources to pay for the loss and damages of the climate change that's already here, and to have the resources to leapfrog to a post-carbon economy, to go straight to renewables, to go straight to the best public transit available. And the way we need to pay for it is we need to have the polluters pay. We need to go after the fossil fuel companies. So I'm going to pass it over to Tajio Muller, who is going to, no, too loud. Okay, I'll come back to you guys at the end. But that's our job. We don't share this information with you to feel disempowered, to feel like the corporations are going to always win. Because the most important thing we need to remember is that the climate movement is a movement on the roll. On a roll. We come here even though our politicians lack the ambition and the vision and the boldness that we deserve. This is a movement that comes here after winning big victories and with many more victories on the way. So we need to look at these barriers as a challenge, and we need to understand that we're going to win this. Thank you.